Willkommen bei Kontext TV. Wir sind in der Universität in Leuven, Belgien.
Welcome to Kontext TV. We are here at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Our guest today is Norman Finkelstein. Finkelstein is political scientist in the US and author of several books, including This Time We Went Too Far, Truth and Consequences of the Gaza Invasion, and Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. His book, The Holocaust Industry, got worldwide attention and initiated a heated debate.
TV, Mr. Finkelstein, it's great to have you with us. In 1995, you wrote a book, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. So what is the image and what is the reality of this conflict in your view?
Well, you have to bear in mind that book was written nearly 2 decades ago. And what I described as the image and reality spoke to what the current image was at that particular moment. It's changed radically in the last 20 years. That's actually the subject of my most recent book, Knowing Too Much, that the public perceptions, in particular on college campuses and among, so to speak, educated people who read the mainstream journals and so forth, the image of Israel has changed radically. Back then, Israel was seen pretty much in fairly conventional propagandistic terms as having turned the desert into having made the desert bloom, fighting these terrorists and backward Arabs. It was sort of a cowboy and Indian version of history. In the case of the American history, it was conquering a wilderness, and here it was turning, as I said, making a desert bloom. But now much more is known about the history of the conflict, much more is known about Israel's conduct. And so a lot of what I wrote in that book 20 years ago is not at all controversial anymore. It's extensively referenced, so there's a lot of evidence to support my claims, but the claims themselves are not really controversial anymore.
There has been a bloody history of violence, wars, and invasion in Israel and Palestine since 1948, when the State of Israel was founded. The latest military escalations were the bombings of Gaza in 2008 and 2012. You wrote, This Time We Went Too Far. Talk about the history, the military history of violence in Palestine and Israel, and the notion of Israeli self-defense.
Well, probably the best book on the topic is by an Israeli author named Ze'ev Ma'oz. He wrote a book called Defending the Holy Land. And what's important about the book is that it's based on all with emphasis on all the available scholarship, current scholarship on the history of Israel's wars and engagements, military engagements with its neighboring countries. And the conclusion he reaches is, I'm quoting him pretty close to verbatim, with the possible exception of the 1948 war. He says, none of the wars Israel has fought since 1948 can be described as a no-choice war. In every one of those cases, in every one of the wars, with the possible exception of 1948, Israel was not engaging in self-defense. These were as I think he put it, these were self-made disasters or self-made wars. In legal jargon, they would be called wars of aggression.
Can you give an example for that?
Well, the interesting thing is to find a counterexample. The standard counterexample is, of course, the June 1967 war, which is sometimes held up as a prototypical preemptive war of self-defense. There's no evidence for that. The two basic facts about the June 1967 war, the two basic facts which are no longer subject to any contradiction or any refutation are, number one, President Nasser of Egypt did not intend to attack. And number two, everybody agreed that if he did attack against all odds and all predictions, if he did attack, that Israel would easily knock him out. Or as President Johnson at the time of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, said to the Israelis, he said, well, number one, all our intelligence says that Egypt is not going to attack you, and number two, if it does, you'll whip the hell out of them, which is exactly what happened.
I want to switch to the diplomatic process of the Israel-Palestine conflict, especially after 1967. Well, there is a two-state settlement on the table roughly since the mid-70s, based on UN Resolution 242, supported by virtually the whole world, including the Arab states, Iran, PLO, but also Hamas and Hezbollah. The basic idea of this settlement is not very complicated: a Palestinian state inside the international recognized borders before the Six-Day War of 1967. So why can't this solution be implemented, knowing that this would surely mitigate the violence and tensions in the region?
Well, it's not unusual that the United States has been able to block implementation of many resolutions of conflicts, and has been a major impediment to the resolution of conflicts. So it's not surprising that in this case as well, the U.S. is an impediment. There is a slight difference, however. In most cases, the U.S. has been an impediment, an obstacle, because it conceived its national interests as being in opposition to a particular resolution of a conflict. Here it's not the U.S. national interest. In my opinion, it's the Israel lobby that's been able to exert sufficient pressure on the U.S. that the U.S. goes along with the Israeli rejectionism, even though the U.S. has no real stake in opposing a Palestinian state.
Israel and the US have long outright rejected a Palestinian state. Now they are talking about it. But then you have all the vetoes in the UN Security Council concerning a Palestinian state. They just voted no against the UN General Assembly resolution that upgrades the Palestinian Authority to a non-member state. So what is all this talk about?
You have to specify what you mean by a Palestinian state. You can have a Palestinian state declared in this room, but is that a real state? What Israel has been talking about, it's been pretty clear over the years for those who care to look at their actual record and not at the rhetoric. If you go back as far as negotiations in January 2001, after the Camp David negotiations, there were what were called the Clinton parameters in December 2000. And then after that, there was a resumption of negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians at this Egyptian resort called Taba. And if you look at the maps presented at Taba, and you look at the maps presented during what were called the Annapolis negotiations in the George Bush presidency, it all is pretty much the same. They want to keep what they call Israel wants to keep what it calls the major settlement blocks, which will encompass approximately 9% of the West Bank. And they're building the wall, as the International Court of Justice put it. The wall takes this sinuous route, and the route goes all around the settlement blocks, and Israel has conceded that they're building their new border. The wall is not a wall to fight terrorism, it's a wall to create a new border for Israel. And they want to incorporate the settlement blocks. If they succeed in that, then there's no Palestinian state. First of all, it takes a lot of the best agricultural land, the most arable Palestinian land is incorporated inside the wall. Second of all, it takes the critical water resources, which are located inside the wall. And third of all, it bisects and trisects the West Bank, because the wall includes the settlement called Ariel Shamron in the north, and the settlement called Ma'ale Adumim in the center of the West Bank. Ma'ale Adumim bisects the West Bank between the north and the south, and Ariel and Shamron bisects the northern part of the West Bank. So between the settlement blocks, if they're annexed, there's not going to be a Palestinian state. There'll be some people want to call it cantons, some people want to call it Bantustans, whatever. What are Bantustans? Bantustans refers to the homelands that the South African apartheid regime allotted to the indigenous population of South Africa, the black South Africans. There were 10 of them, of the 10 Bantustans, 5 or 6 were eventually granted what was called statehood. There was Transkei, then Ciskei, then Bophuthatswana, then Venda, and these were makeshift, quote-unquote, states, which incidentally got exactly 0 recognition in the United Nations. Everybody understood these are not serious states. These are residues that South Africa allotted to the indigenous population as it proceeded to consolidate its control over South Africa. And basically that's what Israel will leave for the Palestinians. So the state they're talking about is not a state.
There was a summit in Taba in 2001. Then US President Bill Clinton led the negotiations between Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, and the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat. They came reportedly very close to a settlement. What happened in Taba? And how could what was almost reached in Taba be resumed today to achieve peace in Palestine and Israel?
That's what they said, but I don't really agree with that. A lot of people have repeated the claim that was made that they came very close, because each side had a stake in claiming that. The Palestinian side makes that claim because it wants to validate the notion of negotiations. So it keeps saying, we were so close. They say in Annapolis, we were so close. They say with the the offer of Ehud Olmert in 2008, we were so close, because they want to validate what they've been doing the last 20 years, which is basically talking about Israel steals the West Bank. And the Israeli side, some of the negotiators, like Shlomo Ben Ami, he has an agenda. He also wants to show that we were so close, and it was only because of the fact that Sharon won the election in 2001. That's why it didn't happen. It's not true. We have to be honest about these things, because the most important thing is clarity. The map they were offering in Taba, the map they were offering, Israel was offering, included Israel keeping all the settlement blocks. There was no change there. On the issue of refugees and so forth, there was no progress made. That's the facts.
What has been the role of the US and European countries in the diplomatic process?
Well, there's a very big distinction between the European countries and the United States. European countries say the right thing, but do the wrong thing, or do nothing. The United States says the wrong thing and does a lot in support of doing the wrong thing. So the battle is easier in the the battle is easier in the EU and in Europe generally, because the battle in Europe is to force the governments to act in accordance with their words. The EU the European countries have repeatedly, in all the relevant forums, upheld a settlement in the June 1967 border with the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, the Palestinian state. They've been very clear about that. They've been very clear that the settlements are illegal under international law. So the problem with the Europeans is they don't act on their words. You have to force them, put pressure on them to get them to make their actions cohere or correspond with their words. The US, the battle is much more difficult, because you still have to get them to even acknowledge what's right. So you still have a battle for public opinion, you still have a battle in government, huge battle, where they don't even accept in principle the basics of international law. So in the US, it's still an uphill battle. In the case of Europe, it's It's a battle, but not nearly as difficult. Even people like Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, who's certifiably insane on the question of Israel and the Holocaust and everything, she still thinks that Hitler is in his bunker and she's on a commando raid to kill him. She's a lunatic. But even she is losing patience with the Israelis. This guy Netanyahu is a liar, he's a thief. And they're losing patience. So even, Israel's most stalwart ally in Europe, namely Germany, they're losing. They're losing Germany. Especially if you look at the public opinion polls. I mean, disaster for Israel. Complete disaster across Europe. I am not including Eastern Europe because Eastern Europeans are slightly different. They're all anti-Semites and they really do believe that Israel controls the United States and Israel controls the world. And if you want to get into the good graces of the United States, you have to be nice to Israel. They believe that. They believe. And then the Israelis cultivate it. The Israelis tell them, we have entree to the White House. You do this for us and we'll get this deal for you or that deal for you. And so they, you saw it just now with the whole Bulgarian claim about Hezbollah blowing up a bus, for which there's exactly zero evidence. But they do it because the Bulgarians are threatened by Israel. If you don't do this, we're going to cause troubles for you in the United States. And of course, the U.S. also wanted to nail the Hezbollah. So the only exception in Eastern Europe is really Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic. And that's because during the era when Czechoslovakia was under Soviet control, Arafat used to go to visit a lot Czechoslovakia. And so the people now hate the Palestinians because of that memory. So there is a lot of popular hatred of Palestinians in the Czech Republic, which explains that particular lunacy. The Czech are more pro-Israel probably than any country in the world except for Canada under the lunatic Harper. But with that exception, countries like Poland, they believe all the anti-Semitism. They do. They believe Jews control the world. If you want to be in the good graces of the United States, you have to kowtow to Israel. The Western Europeans, they're too enlightened for that, and the Central Europeans. And so for them, it's just like the Palestinians are not important enough to do anything about. Who cares about them? But in principle, the European record is not bad. No question in my mind about that.
What could they do to put pressure?
The Europeans, I think the basic things they can do is, I think they should uphold international law. The law is pretty clear. Number one, as Amnesty International said, there should be a comprehensive arms boycott on Israel, and they also say Hamas, but Hamas has no weapons, so it's a meaningless gesture. A comprehensive arms boycott. They should uphold the decision of the 2004 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. They should impose sanctions until Israel dismantles the wall. That's the law. They should impose sanctions on Israel until it not only stops building settlements, until, as the last report of the Human Rights Council says, until the settlements are dismantled. You don't have the right, in the lunacy that we have called the peace process, the only debate is whether or not Israel should be allowed to continue building settlements while it's negotiating peace. Whereas the only sane question should be, should Israel be allowed to negotiate before it's dismantled all the settlements? The settlements are illegal. So they should all be dismantled before negotiations begin. That's the law. The law is, under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the settlements are a war crime. So the war crime has to be undone. So even if we don't talk about being undone, they certainly have to be stopped. So there are all sorts of sanctions the EU can apply to enforce the law. There's no opposition in Israel to the occupation. It doesn't exist because the occupation doesn't exist. This is the first cost-free occupation in the history of the world. The Palestinians do all the policing, torture, killing for the Israelis. That's called the Palestinian Authority. The Europeans and the Gulf countries, they pay all the bills. So Israel blows up Gaza, the Netherlands, Belgium, they all move in to give money again. Israel blows it up again, the Europeans pay for it again. So the Europeans pay all the bills, and the Americans do all the political blocking for Israel at the relevant forums, legal and political in the world. So Israelis, the occupation doesn't exist for them. They have a very good life. The economy is thriving, doing much better than certainly any of the other European or American, North American economies. There are significant significant divisions in income distribution and so forth. Israel is now the second most unequally distributed country in the world of wealth, unequal distribution of wealth after the United States in the industrialized countries. But basically, there is no occupation. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody talks about it. The last election, about which so much has been said, the most fundamental fact about the election is the occupation never came up. It was fought over domestic issues. The occupation wasn't a topic of the last election. Nobody cares about it.
One of your latest books, Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End, you analyze a change in how liberal Jews in the US are viewing Israel and the Palestinians. What do you mean by that?
So American Jews are liberal, resolutely liberal, overwhelmingly. And being liberal means belief in the rule of law, equality under the law, resolving conflicts through negotiations, not through force, the usual liberal tenets. And the Israeli, and it's impossible anymore for American Jews to reconcile their avowed liberalism with the way Israel carries on. You know, Israel is a kind of lunatic state. It's a Genghis Khan state. No offense to Genghis Khan. He's probably got a bad reputation. Wasn't as bad as they claim. Or Attila the Hun. And so American Jews, this whole Israel thing, it's looking kind of bizarre. This is kind of a weird state. And it's going over the cliff, politically, ideologically. So American Jews are, especially younger American Jews, who are pretty secular and assimilated. 60% of American Jews are marrying non-Jews. And all the ruling class families, political elites, they're all marrying Jews. So this Israel thing has, we don't want to say it's in its death throes, but it's clearly no longer a primary item on the agenda of American Jews. Which is not to say if Israel's physical annihilation were threatened. If its physical annihilation were threatened, the American Jews would rally behind it. In my opinion, they should. No country should be physically annihilated. But short of its physical annihilation, the honeymoon with Israel is over. And we may not be at a divorce stage, but I think we're at, if we can use the expression, we're at the point of a trial separation.
You also wrote a book about Gandhi, what Gandhi says about nonviolence, resistance, and courage. Talk about your findings and how they relate to strategies of resistance or mobilization in the Israel-Palestine conflict to achieve peace.
Gandhi attaches a lot of value to nonviolence, no question about it. It's an important value for him. It is not the most important value. Gandhi is very emphatic. The most important value to him is courage. It is not nonviolence. And he says it over and over again. He says, if you have a choice, if you can't find the inner strength, the inner wherewithal to be nonviolent, and you're being assaulted, your dignity is being attacked, if you don't have the strength to be nonviolent, then you sure as heck had better be violent. And the worst thing for Gandhi is a person who, in the face of an assault on his or her dignity or assault on his or her life, if that person flees and claims, why am I fleeing? Because I'm nonviolent. Gandhi says, you're not fleeing because you're nonviolent. You're fleeing because you're a coward. That's why there's no inconsistency between Gandhi attaching the highest value to courage and also attaching a very high value to nonviolence. The two are completely reconcilable when you understand what Gandhi means by nonviolence. Nonviolence means getting yourself killed.
And what does it, and how does it relate to the Israel-Palestine conflict and mobilization for it?
Well, I think how it relates is Gandhi starts from a basic premise. He says you can accomplish anything with nonviolence that you can accomplish with violence, with the exception that, not with the exception, but with the additional fact that it will probably cost much less in blood in the end. I think there are real prospects for a mass civil disobedience in the occupied territories. I think Israel will have a big problem trying to repress it because Israel is now very vulnerable on the issue of international law, violations of human rights. Israel is always fearful of that Goldstone II report, as they call it. They're terrified because this time it might go to the International Criminal Court, which the first one was supposed to go to, but never got there.
Just explain what the Goldstone report is.
After the Israeli massacre in Gaza in December 27th to January 18th, 2008-9, Israel committed massive atrocities, by its own admission, by the way, in the course of the assault on Gaza, and or I should say the admission of its soldiers, in its assault and its massacre in Gaza. And afterwards, the UN Human Rights Council appointed a Richard Goldstone, the South African jurist, to investigate what happened. He went with a team over there, and he wrote a pretty damning report on what happened. And then the report made clear that Israel is going to be held accountable this time. And it looked like it might actually come near, the U.S. of course was going to block it, but come near the International Criminal Court or some other legal body. And then the Israelis hounded Goldstone for about 2 years. He eventually recanted. Nobody quite knows why, what happened. My own suspicion, can't prove it, so I freely admit I can't prove it, is that they found something on him or his daughter, who's an Israeli citizen, and blackmailed him into recanting. But the Israelis have been very worried about this prospect. At what point, when the Goldstone report was still alive, Prime Minister Netanyahu says we're facing 3 existential threats. Number 1, Iran. Number 2, the Hezbollah-Hamas missiles. And number 3, Goldstone. Goldstone was a very serious concern for them. And so Israel is feeling now very, very hemmed in on the issue of human rights. And you saw it in the last assault on Gaza, where because there were foreign reporters there, unlike in the first attack, because the Goldstone report, Goldstone II, hovered over them, and because of the Turkish-Egyptian message to Obama, Israel will not do another Operation Cast Lead. That was what was called in 2008. They will not do another Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. Those days are over. Gaza is not going to be a shooting gallery anymore for Israel. It's not going to be fish in a barrel. And for those various reasons, even though Israel committed its usual atrocities, killed about 150 people, it was much less than what they did in Operation Cast Lead. Much less. And that was in the face of, theoretically, I don't believe the hype, but the 1,500, what they call the 14 or 1,500 excuse me, Hamas missiles and projectile attacks, they still were very limited in what they could do because they have the threat of the vulnerability now, extreme vulnerability on the human rights issue. If you bear in mind how, relatively speaking for Israel, how little it was able to do in November 2012 when it attacked Gaza for 8 days, if there's a nonviolent resistance, I don't think they can do much. I think they'll have a very hard time. And I think the Gandhian tactics can work.
You criticize the international campaign Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, short BDS. First of all, explain what BDS is and why you criticize it.
There's a sanctions campaign against Israel, trying to get international sanctions, modeled in some respects on the South African anti-apartheid movement, AAM it was called back then, a sanctions campaign. To try to impose Israel's sanctions on Israel, basically at multiple levels. At the level, of course, of the United Nations to get UN sanctions. At the popular level, various forms of people's boycotts and so forth to get sanctions, and also at the national level by trying to get states either on their own initiative or through popular pressure to impose sanctions. As a matter of principle, of course, I support sanctions being imposed on Israel in order to try to get it to conform to international law. So there's no dispute or argument between me and what's called the Bds Movement. The thing about the Bds Movement is what I don't find particularly appealing about it is, number one, it's hypocrisy, and number two, it's dishonesty. And I'm kind of old-fashioned about that. Maybe I don't belong in politics, and I often think I don't belong in politics because I find hypocrisy and dishonesty distasteful. The hypocrisy of BDS is, if you read their publications, they always claim that they're just trying to implement international law, that they are anchored in international law. If you read, for example, one of the leaders of BDS's book, BDS, every other page is international law, international law, international law. So they say they want to implement 3 aspects of international law. Number 1, Israel has to end the occupation. Number 2, there has to be equality of Palestinian Arab citizens in Israel. And number 3, there has to be full implementation of the Palestinian right of return. Okay, I'm not going to discuss those 3 aspects for the moment, but there's another aspect of international law, and that's Israel. Israel is a state. Under international law, it has the same rights and responsibilities, the same rights and obligations as any other state. So you ask BDS, okay, you want to implement international law. So that means, of course, recognizing that Israel is a state and has the same rights. They say, no. We take no position on Israel. Well, how can you take no position on Israel? If you want the right of self-determination of Palestinians, as they claim they do, if you want the right of self-determination of Palestinians, up to and including the creation of an independent Palestinian state, that's what self-determination in one of its versions is, the right to statehood and independence, then Israel is a state. That's its expression of self-determination. It's a state. Well, they take no position on that. Well, how can you be for upholding international law and take no position on Israel? That doesn't make any sense. That's literally nonsensical. It's sort of like Hamlet, the play Hamlet, without the Prince of Denmark. Israel is part of the conflict. How can you have an Israel-Palestine conflict upholding the rule of law and having no position on Israel? That doesn't make any sense. Then there's the level of dishonesty. They do take a position on Israel. The position is they don't want it to be there. Then just say it. Don't pretend to something that's not true. you don't really take no position on Israel. You have an implicit position. Your view is, if we end the occupation, we implement the law of return, we get equal rights, we'll eliminate Israel by stealth. Okay, you're entitled to that position. But then admit to it. And don't play this duplicitous game of saying, oh, we take no position. Of course you take a position. You just do the addition. You have a position there. So let's be honest about that. And then there's the third thing, which is politics. I dealt with the hypocrisy. I dealt with the dishonesty. And I'm dealing with the fantasy. There is exactly zero support in the world today for eliminating the state of Israel. Now, you can talk about, oh, we don't mean physically eliminating it. No, I agree. Most of you, not all of you, but most of you aren't talking about physically eliminating it. That's true, I agree with that. But there's no support for eliminating it in any way. Is there any forum in the world today, any forum, where even one member speaks about eliminating the state of Israel? Is there any? The United Nations, obviously no, there's no member. Arab League talks about a two-state solution on the June 67 border. Organization of the Islamic countries, the OIC, 57 Muslim countries, all speak about a two-state settlement, including Iran. Is there any significant legal or human rights body that speaks about eliminating Israel? The answer is no. The realistic steps are right there. The realistic step is you have to force Israel to enforce the law. That's very simple. Israel has to enforce the law. And that's a message that a broad public can understand. People understand the rule of law, in particular Jews. So many of them are lawyers. They understand the rule of law. And you have to force that issue. But the law is inclusive. It's not just Palestinian self-determination. Sure, Palestinians have the right to self-determination. That's not up for grabs. That's a fact. Their right has been validated, the right to self-determination. But Israel is a state. That's its expression of its self-determination of its population under international law. And if you want to abandon international law, I don't see any way to reach a broad public.
Your book, The Holocaust Industry, steered a lot of discussion in Germany when it came out in 2000. Explain, first of all, what the Holocaust industry is, what you found out, and what you respond to critics saying that the study isn't accurate and that it serves anti-Semitic attitudes.
The book is no longer controversial. I mean, at the time I wrote the book, I said that Israel has used the Nazi Holocaust as a weapon, an ideological weapon, basically for political reasons, in order to silence criticism of Israel by saying that after all the suffering Jews have endured, they shouldn't be held to the same moral, legal standards as everybody else. That was the whole point of this. The Nazi Holocaust is incomparable, it's unique. If the suffering was unique, then it shouldn't be held to conventional moral, legal standards. It should be held to a unique standard because of its unique suffering. So it was being used as a political weapon, and it was also being used at the time, because I was writing in the 1990s, as a financial weapon, a shakedown of Europe, the so-called Holocaust compensation, reparations. Nobody any longer denies that Israel uses the Holocaust as a political weapon. I mean, even Avraham Berg, the former head of the Israeli Knesset, in his book on the Nazi Holocaust, he referred, like on page 4, to the Holocaust industry, at that expression. At the time, I was so indignant, how could I use that expression? Now it's just passed into a commonplace, the Holocaust industry. And as to the financial side, the top person in the world, Raoul Hilberg, the founder of the whole field of Holocaust studies, he authored the standard 3-volume, The Destruction of the European Jews. Hilberg said, not only were my findings right, not only were they meticulous, he said they were conservative. That actually, the actual picture of the shakedown, the racket, was much worse. He was the one who said, before me, by the way, in 1999, he said, and now I'm quoting him, for the first time in history, the Jews are using the blackmail weapon.
And what groups were involved in this?
It was a lot of the Jewish organizations in the United States, but mostly it was the World Jewish Congress, run by this multi-billionaire blowhard named Edgar Bronfman and his sidekick, Rabbi Israel Singer. Singer ended up stealing, it was funny, because they were attacking the Swiss banks because of their secret Swiss bank accounts. It turned out that he was stealing money from the World Jewish Congress, and where was he putting it? In a secret Swiss bank account. So Singer disappeared from the scene. As did most of them. Most of them ended up being in jail or crooks. Alan Hevesy, Bert Newborn, he used to say, I do everything pro bono. I called him the pro bono Holocaust huckster. He ended up taking $4 million from the German case, $4 million. He tried for $4 million from the Swiss case. Finally, even the New York Times, which supported the Holocaust shakedown from the beginning to the end, even they ran an editorial saying, look, Mr. Newborn, this is getting a little bit unseemly, a little bit embarrassing. You're such a crook. So the only one actually who ended up out of jail was me.
And you said that the Germans actually paid better to the Holocaust survivors than the Jewish Claims Conference.
Yeah, the German record on reparations was very good. I mean, you may question their motives, but the record was very, the sums they paid out. The problem is a lot of the money they gave to the Claims Conference, the Jewish Claims Conference, as I prefer to call it, the Jewish Crooks Conference, and the money just didn't go to the survivors. My father got paid directly from the Germans. I got a check promptly every month. I remember it. I can see it in my mind's eye, and it's so long ago now. So long ago now. It used to come in the distinctive blue envelope, and I remember the return address was Hanover, and he got it every month. Even when he was dying, he was in the hospital, I had to each month go to the German consulate and certify that he was still alive. They were sticklers. It's the law. It's Germans, So I had to certify that he was still alive, but till the last day he got the checks. My mother, for reasons not worth going into, was supposed to be paid through the Jewish Claims Conference, the Jewish Crooks Conference, and she got $3,000.
Thanks a lot for the interview, Mr. Finkelstein.